I would join them, there were about 7 offices. We grew it to 25 locations through acquisition. And today they're at 40 locations.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Commercial Real Estate Secrets. I'm your host, Austin Hare, and our guest is Sina.amiri. He's the Vice President of Business Development and Partnerships at Zentist, which is a company that essentially helps put your dental insurance billing on autopilot. And prior to Zentist, he ran a private equity-backed DSO in Canada with 25 practices. So got a lot of experience in the DSO and the dental industry. And so Sina, it's great to have you on the show today. Thanks.
Austin, thanks so much for the invitation. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. Cool. So yeah, you've had a good background in the DSO industry, and so still a young guy, still got plenty of run rate left. And I'm curious, like, were you born in Canada?
I wasn't. So I'm a first generation immigrant to Canada. My parents immigrated from the Middle East, and we ended up settling in Canada primarily because I had an uncle that was living not too far away from Toronto. And, it just made sense given the fact that we had a relative here to move over here. The transition for me actually occurred when I was in the 4th grade. And so, coming to a country where you don't actually speak any English, going through that process and kind of learning how to really operate right in a whole new environment was interesting for me. I would say young enough to be able to not feel as much pain as somebody who's, let's say, in their teenage years or a little bit older. So that was a good experience for me, and made a lot of friends along the way, and kind of got Canadianized playing street hockey and a few other sports.
How old were you when you guys moved over?
I was 10 years old. So my birthday
Okay.
was actually on a plane ride over to Canada.
Wow. So is English not your first language then?
English isn't my first language. So I have 2 siblings, and after high school, they ended up moving to the States. I've always traveled back and forth between US and Canada, primarily because most of the work that I've done over the years has been with a lot of US dental practices and DSOs. And the company I'm with now, Zentist, is actually headquartered in San Francisco.
Okay. So you're 10 years old. You moved over here from the Middle East to Canada, over on the West Coast, the west side of the culture. And so what was that like? Did you know that you wanted to get into dentistry? I mean, like as a kid, did you have a burning desire to be successful or be the best at anything? Like, I'm just curious, like what was, from the time you moved over to the time you graduated high school, like what did that look like?
So as you know, there's a saying that if you're in the Eastern cultures part of the world, there's a lot of professions that are not considered professions. I mean, if you're an engineer, doctor, lawyer, that's kind of what your parents tend to gravitate towards. I actually, from I would say younger age, had healthcare in mind, but my sister, who used to watch the show called Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, knew from a very, very young age, way younger than me, that she wanted to be a doctor. And I considered, do I go into medical or dental? But at the time, I didn't like the notion of being in school for, 8 years and then 12 years if I wanted to do a specialization. And so for me, the idea of coming out of school with a lot of debt, and then not really working until my late 20s wasn't too pleasing. And so I really wanted, when I was a kid, I ran a lot of side hustles, I would say, as far as selling chips door to door, removing people's snow, taking out their garbage. And I love the fact that if you were creative, you could do something with your hands, and you had this sense of autonomy. And so I wanted to pursue business ownership, but because my parents had sacrificed a lot moving to Canada, my dad didn't really like the idea of me just right after high school starting a business. And so I ended up getting some data in terms of, when I was in high school, what are the occupations that pay well. I wanted to have some degree of social impact. So dentistry was like number 1 on the list, it turns out, because you could own your own business right after graduation. But when I looked at the amount of capital required to actually build a practice, at the time, I think the number was something like $400,000 to $500,000 was the average rate. That intimidated me, frankly. So I said, if I like entrepreneurship and I want to do something related to business. Why don't I just pursue a business degree? And that's when I ended up applying to business school, did my undergraduate degree in marketing. Um, and that exposed me to, a new world where, it's something that I feel like applies to a lot of different professions. Like if you understand, the theories behind marketing and branding, it helps you regardless of, I think, what type of role you're in. So I ended up doing that. And then about 18 months before I even graduated from that program, I was introduced through a professor of mine to a founder of a healthcare IT company that was in a lot of hospitals and health systems in terms of the products that they delivered, which was software for things like infection control management and electronic health records, radiology information systems. So I ended up working for that company before I graduated. I convinced some of my professors to actually let me work at this company rather than going to their class if I handed in certain assignments and projects related to that experience. And that was kind of my first break into healthcare. And I became really obsessed with it because I felt like here's something where there's difficult problems to solve, but at the same time, ultimately what drove me was the fact that I felt like the technology that we were offering these hospitals ultimately would help with patient care, right? And improving patient care. And in the healthcare industry, technology did lag behind a lot of other industries. And so I felt really excited about the fact that given the percentage of, capital that's getting spent on taking care of our population, if you can bring in technologies that assist with reducing costs, ultimately the patient will benefit from that.
So a couple of things that you mentioned. First of all, sounds like you had to essentially write a thesis paper in high school, convincing your parents that you didn't have to go to become an actual doctor in order to be successful and make money, right?
That's correct. I mean, one way that I did it, probably subconsciously, was, I wasn't an A+ student. I was an A+ student in elementary school and like grade 7 and 8. But my grades slipped a little bit just because I wasn't going to that many classes, frankly, in high school. But for me, I just couldn't see myself being chairside all day and confined to a 10 by 10 room. And so part of me, again, was attracted to the healthcare industry because of the social impact that it could have. But I wasn't like my sister, right? In terms of just totally being obsessed with, serving the patients day in and day out as a clinician, working with your hands.
And so you mentioned you weren't like an A+ student at this stage, which I think is interesting and honestly totally fine. And so, what part of how much of your education do you think was everything that you specifically learned in college versus actually being proactive, right? And what I mean by that is like, did you study any books, like, self-development books or I guess, any business related books, like proactively on your own, like taught you like, how to make money and how to be successful or how to balance your time? Like, were you doing those things in conjunction to what you were learning at school or no?
I was the type of kid in high school where, if, my teacher was teaching physics, right? And Newtonian physics, I would be reading books, on physics that were published in the last couple of years, talking about, like challenging some of the existing beliefs, right, that were taught in the classroom. So, looking at quantum mechanics and looking at some of these other fields for me was more fascinating. So I felt like I was learning more from the books that I was reading on my own time versus what I was getting taught in school. I kind of questioned a lot of what was getting taught just because it didn't jive with, what I knew about that particular subject, having picked up books from the library on my own. And I think at the same time, one of the interesting events that occurred when I was a kid was in the 5th grade, my dad started looking at buying a business, and he came to Canada with not much money. And so he had to make a decision basically when I was in the 5th or 6th grade as to whether or not, he decides to buy a house and we move into a nicer neighborhood, or does he go after buying a business. And when you're new to a country, there's not a lot of businesses you can buy that you know how to operate right from scratch. So a lot of these immigrants, they tend to gravitate towards businesses in the restaurant industry. And so that's what my dad did. He ended up with my uncle buying, believe it or not, a pizza joint when I was in the 6th grade. And I worked in that pizza joint from the 6th grade to the 11th grade and essentially saved enough money to pay my own way through college. And in that particular business where I worked, my sister worked there, my mom worked in there. You had this, small world of individuals trying to run this enterprise, small little enterprise. But through that, you learn things like customer service. You learn about pricing. Because as an example, when my dad took over the restaurant, he never changed the menu or the pricing. And so in the summer, we used to have lineups of over like 100 people outside the door waiting to grab a slice of pizza. Why? Because we're selling it for $2.50. You get 2 slices and a can of pop. And so our competitors were selling their pizza for $5. And I was trying to convince my dad at the time, hey, you should increase your pricing. But I'm a 12-year-old kid, right? What do I know? And so I felt that was really a defining moment in my own personal development because it gave me exposure to how a small business operates at a very young age, and to understand the concept of profit margin and pricing and marketing in particular, and then also having customers at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the morning that are coming from the bar, walking into your store, and like how do you manage that, right? And many times I was there at that time of night working away.
That's cool. Yeah, the school of hard knocks, as they like to call it. So, yeah, that's great. A great way to answer that question. Yeah, you had your first like hands-on experience running a business, seeing what it was like from the operational side. And so that brings me back to the whole point about college. I think that it is necessary, obviously, to go to college if you want to be a dentist or a doctor or a lawyer or a engineer or something that like really requires a specific degree. But like for me, it didn't. I graduated college, literally didn't help me at all. It hasn't done anything except for it was a fun time, right? And so like my question is, do you think you would have ended up in the same spot? Do you think it was necessary for you to go to college given your track that you took? Sounds like you were able to get introduced to some people, so maybe it was, but I'm just curious what your take on that is.
Yeah, if you speak with my classmates, I think a lot of them when I was in college would tell you that Sina is the best at getting in front of people and being able to connect with people. And so I always felt that regardless of whether I pursued higher education, I would be able to build a successful career for myself. I'm actually very grateful for the fact that I did end up pursuing higher education, because when I look back, I did have professors that were instrumental in my personal development. And I was the type of student that would oftentimes, during my lunch break or in between classes, actually spend time with my business professors. And really, it was through those relationships that I got introduced to companies like General Motors, where I did a contract for them, essentially helping them launch a new vehicle within a particular market in Canada. So I feel like if I hadn't had the relationships with these professors, and a lot of them I'm still friends with to this day, I wouldn't be as successful as quickly. So I do believe that.
Yeah.
I think you still have to, as an individual, look at your effort, because there's a lot of people that frankly go through the motions, right, when they're in college.
Yeah.
So you just have to look at yourself and say, what's best for my personal development, and you can. For me, learning has never stopped, right? And that's what I've noticed with some other people that maybe haven't had as much success, is that they stop learning when they get out of school. And for me, I've always been a curious person, so I'm always looking to learn from other people and learn from books and learn from podcasts like this.
Yeah, so for you, it sounds like it wasn't necessarily the degree that was valuable as much as it was you had a platform to get in touch and build relationships with professors that gave you opportunities.
I would absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you look at the first foray that I had into healthcare, it was really because my professor, whose wife was a nurse, ended up going to a conference and connected with this particular founder of a tech company, healthcare tech company. And then the professor, because of my relationship, thought, hey, she's looking for somebody to help her with marketing. I know Sina's looking for a part-time gig. Let me make that introduction. I mean, he could have made an introduction to a dozen other students, but it was.
So that was your first stint in healthcare? That's how you got kind of into that industry?
That was my first stint. And so basically, I was asked to go into a trade show, and my CEO, I was at the time, I was 20 years old, and my CEO couldn't make it. And she was scheduled to present to a group of venture capitalists. Her presentation wasn't even done because at the time she was busy onboarding a number of clients. And so she ends up asking me to present instead of her. And so I got up on the stage and essentially pitched the company, right, for the purposes of raising capital, and got bombarded with questions from really smart finance people. And that experience kind of taught me, you always have to be prepared, right? And really preparation for an opportunity is key because you never know when that opportunity is going to get thrown at you.
Were you guys able to successfully raise money?
We were. So we ended up getting an interesting offer from a company that owned multiple enterprise software companies in different parts of healthcare and other industries. And so, thankfully, I didn't get fired. I actually did an enough job to keep my job, and was grateful for that experience.
So then how many things did you do like between that and working with the DSO in Canada?
So what's interesting is that in 2012, so I started my career in medical, right? In the medical industry on the technology side, helping hospitals and health systems evaluate and select software for their business. And so what happened was in 2012, I applied to a company that was in the commercial real estate industry, particularly and really specifically for healthcare. So they had a medical, veterinary, and dental division. On a medical side, they actually did practice management consulting because they had acquired a medical practice management consulting firm, and they had bolted that onto their commercial real estate business. And so when I was essentially made an offer, I was told, you're going to stick it out in dental for about 3 months, but our intent is to actually have you work in a medical consulting side of our business because that's what your background is in. You've had exposure to hospitals and health systems. They did consulting for primary care clinics in Canada. And so I started in 2012 working with dentists for the first time. And it was through that I really fell in love with dentistry, because going back to, if you remember, high school, it was a profession that I was interested in, but I didn't want to practice chairside. And the other thing I was going to tell you is that I did write my hygiene exam after high school. So at 18 years old, I ended up applying to dental hygiene school. Little did I realize at the time that I guess I hadn't gone to the dentist, frankly, myself up until that age. And so I realized quickly, obviously, writing the exam, this is a female-dominated profession. And a few of my friends were joking and saying, are you going to really be a male hygienist? And so I ended up writing the exam, but not going to hygiene school because, 99% of the class would have been female, and I felt a little bit out of place. I believe, by the way, that's one of the fundamental issues today with the shortage of hygienists that we have, is that we have
a stereotype.
Well, it's not necessarily just a stereotype. I think that we need to be able to attract, right, a diverse pool of candidates to these programs, and the students that are interested in the field that happen to be male, right, may not necessarily feel this is the profession for them. I mean, no different than, the fact that a lot of the male, nurses tend to be, a minority within these hospitals. So I think we have to remove the stigma associated with being a male hygienist. And it really starts with when these kids are, in high school, and helping them view this profession as one which they can be very successful in. Because unfortunately, I've interacted with male dental practice owners that frankly won't hire a male hygienist.
That's crazy.
Which is really unfortunate, right? When you look at the fact that, to me, they're no different, right? In terms of they can still take care of the patient the same way anybody could.
Yeah. So, so you're with this real estate company that has this medical arm essentially, and you're supposed to be there for 3 months. But then what happens? I mean, do you end up gravitating towards the dental side and essentially staying there?
Yeah. So what happened was in the first 3 months, I was told you're gonna have to learn the business essentially, and so we don't expect you to get a client, close a deal. We actually want you to utilize some of the more senior staff in your conversations with these dentists because you don't know what you're doing yet. But what happened was I ended up getting my first client that owned 2 practices within the first 15 days and ended up proving that I did have the ability to speak with these clinicians and solve their problems. And so the excitement of getting my first client within the 15 days of joining this company is what essentially got me addicted to dental. And I love the fact that a lot of these individuals are entrepreneurs, right? Because in the medical industry, you deal with a lot of politics and red tape because you're dealing with a large health system or hospital, and there's so many different stakeholders, right? And there's a lot of peer involvement with the business. And so for me, the fact that you had this essentially small business or an entrepreneur that could own their own 3, 4, 5 clinics, and I could work with them, oftentimes reminded me of that early experience that I had, when my dad ran a restaurant. I felt like you could really make a huge impact on these smaller businesses. And so I stuck it out there and ended up working there for 5 years, working with over 5,000 dentists across both Canada and the US. And that experience got me exposed to doctors that were starting practices, relocating their clinics, transitioning. Because if you think about the real estate portion, you know this, Austin, because you've worked in this field for quite a while. When you think about solving the real estate issue that a lot of these doctors have, it's fundamental to the success of their business, primarily because it's very expensive to relocate a dental practice, even across the street. And so we felt like we were making a true impact because at the time, the commercial real estate market was continuing to increase in terms of valuation.
What year was this?
So this was 2012 to 2018 is when so this is post 2008, right? The market had rebounded. And the reality was that a lot of these landlords had the upper hand when it came to negotiating with these dentists that frankly don't understand the lease agreement that they signed, right? And so we were able to bail out a lot of these dentists from really tough situations, considering the fact that they had signed these very onerous agreements and frankly couldn't afford to pick up and move their $1 million clinic and spend another $400,000 plumbing out the new space.
Right. Yeah. Well, dental is very, like you said, it's very expensive. It's one of the most expensive, to build out as a cost per square foot basis. Right now, you're looking at 185 to 200, to sometimes $225 a square foot, because, like you said, all the plumbing, all the fixtures, everything that goes into it, and healthcare is in general very expensive too. And so, yeah, you cannot make that mistake of picking the wrong location. And so we like to say, like, real estate is your first, like, most important decision that you're going to make, because if you go in the wrong spot, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And so that's why you see all the biggest DSOs in the entire world have all picked these retail spots that are very client facing, that are very customer oriented, that are what we consider drive to, not drive through. And it's because it's worth it to them to do it once, do it right, pay the amount, but like now you've got a spot that you can grow into and that can last you for a long, long time. And so, yeah, back in 2012, I think the valley of the real estate market was probably like 2011, maybe late, like early 2012. And so, yeah, at that stage, things are starting to shift a little bit, and they're getting more momentum, like the real estate market's picking up. And so you also have that combined with the fact that, like, DSOs really, the term is not even 20 years old, I don't think. And so a lot of people didn't know what DSOs are. And so landlords don't really want to work with dentists because it's not sexy. Even like as late as the pandemic, you had landlords saying no to dentists, right? Like they want the cool restaurant, they want the bar, the coffee shop, whatever that they think is going to drive a lot of people and drive, other business around. But like what they don't realize is the SBA's list of, every single business, the default rates, dentists were like the fourth best. There's only 3 companies, like 3 industries above them that were better. So pretty much like it's one of the most underrated businesses that there is, because they generally don't fail. Even in the pandemic, like when you saw a lot of businesses going under, they don't had a lot of pent up demand and came back even stronger. And a lot of them had really great years in 2020. And so, yeah, it's a really unique time that you were working on this for your dentist. And so the firm that you were with, was that a like brokerage and development firm, or did they represent, were they like tenant brokers? Were they representing the tenants and helping them find places to go? Like what exactly
It
was
was,
their role?
yeah, great question, Austin. So it was tenant representation on the commercial real estate side for medical doctors, veterinarians, and dentists. And we
Okay.
actually ended up becoming partners with Henry Schein Dental as well as their veterinary division, and so they were exclusive partners with that organization, and obviously that gave them a lot of exposure to thousands of clients that Henry Schein serves across both U.S. and Canada, and then on the development side, what's interesting is that the largest pharmacy chain in Canada was a client of this company, and what they did for that particular client is help them manage their real estate portfolio. So there was this element of working with some of the bigger national healthcare tenants, as far as helping them with location strategy. In addition, as you can imagine, pharmacies like to be close to medical clinics. There's obviously a lot of regulation that prevents any sort of referrals back and forth. But given the exposure that this company had to different aspects of healthcare providers, it was a natural fit for pharmacies to start working with them as well.
So how long were you with this company before you transitioned to the DSO?
So 2012 to 2017. So I was there for 5 years. And what's interesting is that towards the end of that term, the two entrepreneurs that were behind this particular business decided to essentially found a DSO. So they started a DSO through acquisition. I wasn't involved with that, and they primarily did it because they saw what was going on with the consolidation, and they thought if our client base is primarily solo practices, right, we need to have a product, a service, some sort of offering for the DSOs. They initially were going after DSOs as clients, but as you can imagine, some of these DSOs, they will internalize the real estate function, and so they felt that serving solo practices was perhaps a little bit more profitable, right, considering that they needed more help. But they launched this DSO. It's been really successful. And I ended up getting recruited by another DSO essentially, because what I did after this experience with the commercial real estate business is I started my own company consulting for dental practices. And one of my clients who owned 4 practices was looking to acquire another 21 locations. It was 2 different groups that came about. And so I decided to start raising capital for this, ended up making introductions to private equity firms. And one of the private equity firms that I got in front of happened to already have, or was about to make basically an investment within a dental group. And they felt like they were lacking an operations person. And they basically said to me, would you be interested? Now, obviously, I wasn't super excited to leave my consulting business because it was successful. But I thought to myself, how many times you get the opportunity to join a dental group from the ground up and build it into something? I could always go back to consulting. So I went back to my client and I asked him, hey, they made me an offer. And he said, the timing is kind of good because I'm actually going through a divorce. And so I'm not going to be able to transition my practices as expected. And he kind of blessed my transition to this particular role.
That's cool.
Yeah.
How did you raise the capital? Was it relationships that you had built while you were working in commercial real estate?
So interestingly enough, I hadn't had a lot of exposure to the private equity industry when I was working in the commercial real estate side for healthcare. But I was good at knocking on doors. And so I ended up lining up meetings with some of the more prominent private equity firms in Canada and the US, because most of them at the time were interested in getting into the dental space, but many of them didn't have the relationships that I had with dentist entrepreneurs, right? Meaning, it was hard for them to get in front of somebody that owns 6 clinics, and the doctor that owns 6 clinics, like they have options, right? If they're running a healthy business. And so what they were primarily interested in, Keenan, was the fact that I had these relationships, and so I could bring forward an opportunity for them that wouldn't be necessarily on their radar. If it was on their radar, they had no point of differentiation. because these dentist entrepreneurs, they'd known me for several years, right? The private equity relationship was new to them, nor did they really know how to navigate that relationship. And through my consulting business, I actually had an M&A service offering because I ended up partnering with a US-based group that had actually done over $6 billion of M&A in other industries, and they were interested in healthcare. And so I ended up doing a joint venture with them and working with their investment bankers in offering basically, investment advisory services for doctors that are looking to go through that transition or looking to scale through private equity. So we call it prep for private equity. And I ended up learning the ropes from these individuals because they were much more experienced and knowledgeable, and they'd done billions of dollars worth of transactions. And they thought dental would consolidate, and they felt like there wasn't a lot of options that dentists were aware of, because traditionally they just go to the bank for debt financing, or they would sell 80% of their business to a DSO, right? And so I ended up joining this dental group from the ground up. And, when I would join them, there were about 7 offices. We grew it to 25 locations through acquisition. And today they're at 40 locations. And I think we'll get 100 within the next 24 months, primarily because in Canada, the market's much more fragmented. And so there is a huge opportunity for partnerships in the space, given the fact that DSOs are still relatively new phenomena.
Yeah. So sounds like a reoccurring theme is definitely who you know. Like when you get in touch with good people or get in front of good people, trying to develop and cultivate a good relationship with them, because you never know how it's going to pan out. And once you're working with this DSO, I mean, growing from 4 to 25 is obviously a huge feat. What was like the biggest bottleneck that you felt like you faced, and how did you guys overcome that?
So it's always going to come down, in my opinion, to people, because the dental industry, there's not a ton of automation, right? Like what we do as Zentist is we're automating the dental insurance billing process for doctors. I worked for a data analytics company called EDMS. Their dentalytics platform essentially eliminates the need for regional managers and office managers to input data into an Excel spreadsheet to report their KPIs. So there's those things that are automated within the dental practice, but the patient experience for the most part is not, right? And so knowing how much the state of mind that your team members have impact the patient experience, because it's a retail business, to me, it all comes down to, are you able to work with people and really elevate them, right? So that they're performing at their best. And as you know, when you're acquiring practices, each of these practices has its own culture and DNA. And, do you necessarily want to standardize their culture into yours? And like, what are you doing to actually maintain some degree of helping them maintain some degree of autonomy, so that they still feel that it's their clinic, right? And they're continuing to build those relationships they've had for many years with patients, rather than molding into what you're trying to do. And so there is a fine balance between standardization and giving the team members, autonomy. And I felt that in a DSO structure traditionally, decisions were slow to be made, primarily because they required an approval from a manager that wasn't physically in the clinic, right, at all times. And so one of the things that frustrates a lot of team members is the fact that when you're joining a DSO, there are multiple layers of management. But through the pandemic, I was responsible for both closing these clinics for non-elective procedures and then reopening them. And it was through the pandemic that I really learned that you have to allow your frontline employees to make decisions, because in a crisis like what we have with the pandemic, they can't afford to wait, right, 24 hours for a response. And so how do you allow your frontline employees to have the necessary information to make the right decision? And how are you training them to be able to make effective decisions when you're not necessarily present? And so I learned through that experience that you really had to arm your frontline employees with the data that they needed, in addition to the skills, in order to make decisions on their feet, right? Rather than saying it.
So how do you do that? So like tactically speaking, like how do you arm them with the data and the skills that they need to make the decisions?
So I think first and foremost, like what are your objectives as an organization, as a DSO? So most DSOs, they're looking to maintain some degree of obviously profitability, right? Because they want to exist and be able to support other clinicians if they're not profitable. So, with a lot of groups, I've noticed there's a lack of visibility on a P&L on the part of the hygienists and the dentists. And the argument that maybe a DSO will make is that, they're not capable of perhaps analyzing the numbers that we do, or we don't want them to necessarily know the P&L, right? We just want them to focus on patient care. And so the way I look at it is, if you want to obtain, if you want that person to act like an owner, they have to have the same information as the management does. And so you can say to them, hey, don't buy that handpiece or that equipment, right? If they have no idea what your profit margin is, or why you're asking for them to cut expenses, right? Or in many cases, I discovered, and you'll appreciate this, a lot of the dental office employees, team members, don't know how much rent the owner's paying, particularly when the clinic gets affiliated with a DSO.
Yeah.
So that's
They just see the top line in revenue and they think, oh, they're making all this money, but they don't realize all the expense. A lot of times they underestimate the actual expenses that they have. So yeah, I think as entrepreneurs, you think opening up your books to your employees can be detrimental because they're going to see how much money you're making. But like a lot of times they think you're making a lot more than you're making. And when you show them, hey, these are our expenses, then they're like, oh, wow, that's a lot less. Like this $50,000 a month is, you actually have like 40 to 45,000 or $35,000 in expenses. Like, you know what I mean? And so I think it is a great idea. Is that, I mean, I don't want to misinterpret you. Is that kind of what you're saying though?
I think, yeah. So for me, it started with visibility, giving them visibility in terms of like, how is the business truly performing? And like you said, the number of times that a dental assistant who doesn't have anything else to compare to but their own personal, rent, if they're renting a residential unit, thinks you're paying, $8,000 when in fact the rent is $14,000 a month, or they don't have, an idea as to how much the snow removal costs, or, that new piece of equipment that you bought, like what was the price tag for it? Because they're not at all the trade codes looking at equipment, right? They're there for education. And so I found that giving the staff, the employees, the visibility in terms of how the practice is performing, and then arming them with the ability to make decisions, right? So that they're feeling like they have the ability to make an impact. And then at the same time, you also want to reward them. So what we would often do is, take team members out for dinners and always celebrate our wins, because I felt that if they weren't celebrating the small wins, it was going to be tough going, particularly when you're dealing with a shortage of, let's say, dental assistants, and, a receptionist who was formerly a dental assistant has to now go back to chair side to help out that doctor, right? Like what's in it for them? Or do they feel that they get the upside along with the DSO and the organization? And so structuring the incentives accordingly, and also paying people well, right? We paid our hygienists above most other clinics because we felt like, if you take care of those employees, they'll take care of your patients, and you can negotiate the $1 or $2 raise, right? And try to get it to 50 cents. But the reality is that, you're probably not going to get a loyal employee as a result, because you're treating it like a transaction. And so our approach always was, let's actually get these people to go from having a job to having a career. And let's actually figure out how to promote an office, manager to a regional manager if they want to do that. Or a dental assistant that said, hey, I'm taking HR courses at night because I was interested in working in HR. I just pursued dental assisting because at the time I felt like the right thing to do. I want to get into this. So we often had conversations with clinical employees around, here's what we're trying to do with growing the DSO. As we grow the DSO, there's going to be corporate roles that become available. And although there's a preference for a lot of DSOs to hire externally for those corporate roles, given the fact that they feel the clinical employees don't have the business training, I was a big believer in how do you create a platform to train them on the business of dentistry. Because the benefit that you get from those individuals is they can relate to the frontline employees because they've been there, doing suction, right? They've been there with the hygienist or the dentist. And so for me, it was all about creating that learning platform. A lot harder to do than to say from a perspective of execution, but it all starts with your culture and how honest you are with your team members in terms of where you're trying to take this business.
Yeah, yeah. And so we only got a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure that we get time to talk about what you're doing now with Zentist. But in synopsis, yeah, it sounds like when you combine transparency with accountability, those two things together is a really powerful combination. And that's kind of maybe what was missing and what you guys were able to combine to really help you grow and thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say
Yeah.
those are the fundamental building blocks of trust. And trust is the currency of any dental clinic. I don't care what anybody says. You know, it,
Every industry, really, you got to have trust.
absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, and then I know that you had shares in this DSO, and I know when you switched over to Zentist, you retained some of your shares or all of them, and so you still have. I think you're still, I know that you're connected to them. So essentially, you've done a lot in your industry here. It looks like you're probably going to do a lot more. So, like how did you get connected to Zentist? Like how long has that been? How long has that company been around, and what's your what problem does it solve and what's your role there?
So Zentist as a company started building a product in 2015, but it was only in the last, I would say, 12 months that they decided to shift primarily from working with solo practices to dental support organizations. And right now there's 29 different dental support organizations of various sizes that Dentist is working with, and we're onboarding about half a dozen more in the next 2 weeks. And these range in size from as small as 6 or 7 offices to as large as 100 plus locations. And so I've known the founders of Zentist for now over a year. They initially, when they were going to market, had actually asked me for my opinion with regards to what was happening in the industry because of the various roles that I held. And it wasn't until the last really 3-4 months that I felt that they had a strong enough kind of foundation for me to come on board and help them get through the next stage of growth. And so my role at the company is I work with a lot of the DSOs that are looking at standardizing their revenue cycle management function, centralizing their revenue cycle management function. They're wondering how they can scale dental insurance billing as we acquire more clinics, because as you know, insurance and how you deal with insurance at the clinical level impacts patient experience. If you read the majority of Google reviews today that are negative, right? I would say
It's about the
70%
insurance.
of them relate to the patient portion of the payment for that particular treatment. And so eligibility verification is a huge challenge for a lot of these dental practices and DSOs. And what's interesting is that with the growth of DSOs in the industry, part of what practices do, I would argue, has not been automated, primarily because there's been a lack of technology innovation within the dental industry. And DSOs by nature are not technology companies. And so what this has done is essentially taken what has been a manual process and started writing software code and algorithms to automate the process for claims submission as well as claim follow-up. So that instead of your dental office receptionist or somebody at the DSO being on hold with the payer for an hour to get answers on 2 claims, we're using bots to log into the payer portals and fetch the explanation of benefits and get the status of the claim automatically. And so we combine technology with people, and we partner with DSOs and dental practices to ensure that they're spending their time appropriately on the right thing.
Yeah, and I think that's smart what you guys are doing. I think the upside is huge. So I know we're at the end of our time here. What's like if people want to get in touch and learn more, what's a great way to reach out?
So you can email me at sina.amiri@zentist.io. Zentist is spelled Zentist.
Okay.
And the website's zentist.io. And you can also find me on LinkedIn.
Cool. I will put those in the show notes for everybody. And yeah, this has been very insightful. So I appreciate your time coming on, and hope everybody got a couple of nuggets from this.
Well, thanks a lot, Austin. I appreciate what you're doing and looking forward to catching up with you in person at the DEO Summit coming up next week.
Absolutely. It'll be a good time, man. All right. Have a good one. We'll talk soon.
You too. Bye-bye.